Basic switch and end device configuration. Basic switch configuration steps. Access the switch. Enter privileged exec mode. Enter global configuration mode. Set the switch hostname. Prevent unwanted DNS lookups. Configure passwords. Encrypt passwords. Configure interface settings. Configure banner messages. Verify all configuration. Save configuration. Access the switch. Connect to the switch using a console cable and terminal emulation software, such as PuTTY or HyperTerminal. Use the console port on the switch and connect the console cable to the serial port on your computer. Enter privileged exec mode. Access the switch's command line interface, CLI. Enter privileged exec mode by typing switch enable. Switch hashtag. Enter global configuration mode. Enter global configuration mode to make configuration changes. Switch enable. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Enter configuration commands, 1 per line. End with cntl/z switch config hashtag. Set the switch hostname. Assign a name to the switch to help identify it on the network. Switch config hashtag hostname your switch name. Example. Switch. Switch enable. Switch hashtag. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Switch config hashtag hostname switch1. Prevent unwanted DNS lookups. This command prevents the switch from attempting to translate incorrectly entered commands into domain names, which can result in delays or timeouts during the command line interface (CLI) interaction. Configure passwords. Use 3 ways to configure password. They are: secure user exec mode access, secure privileged exec mode access, secure VTY line access. Secure user exec mode access. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Switch config hashtag line console 0. Switch config hashtag password. Switch config line hashtag login. Switch config line hashtag exit. Example. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Switch config hashtag line console 0. Switch config hashtag password Cisco. Switch config line hashtag login. Switch config line hashtag exit. Secure privileged exec mode access. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Switch config hashtag enable secret password. Switch config line hashtag exit. Example. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Switch config hashtag enable secret class. Switch config hashtag password. Switch config line hashtag exit. Secure VTY line access. VTY lines enable remote access using Telnet or SSH to the device. Many Cisco switch support up to 16 VTY line that are numbered 0 to 15. Encrypt passwords. The startup config and running config files display most passwords in plain text. Configure interface settings. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Switch config hashtag interface type and number. Switch config if hashtag IP address IPv4 address subnet mask. Switch config line hashtag no shutdown. Example. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Switch config hashtag interface gigabit Ethernet 0/0/0. Switch config if hashtag IP address 192.168.1.10255.255.255.0. Switch config line hashtag no shutdown. Configure banner messages. A banner message is import to warn unauthorized personnel from attempting to access the device. Note, the hashtag in the command syntax is called the delimiting character. It is entered before or after the message. Switch hashtag configure terminal. Switch, config, hashtag banner emotd hashtag. Enter text message. End with the character hashtag. Authorized access only, hashtag. Verify all configuration. Switch hashtag show running config. Save configuration. Switch hashtag copy running config startup config.